Alright, what's going on everyone? Today, I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Sorin Vampire Lord Planeswalker deck. As always, do keep in mind that these are not intended to be tier 1 decks. If you want that, consider checking out the latest tournament results. What we'll be doing is upgrading this deck card by card, sticking to this deck's themes and doing it on a budget, as we will not exceed the retail price of these decks with our upgrades. Also, two quick notes: if you want the most competitive deck you can possibly get out of the box, I highly recommend the Challenger decks because they're amazing. I'll leave links in the description to those if you want to check them out. Also note that Standard is rotating a few months from this video's release, so just be careful about spending too much money on Standard decks and Standard cards because rotation is incoming. Although of course that is irrelevant if you're not playing in DCI sanctioned tournaments. So anyway, the Sorin Vampire Lord Planeswalker deck is a mono black tribal vampire deck, as you can see with Sorin himself and Thirsting Bloodlord. The deck wants to put a bunch of vampires on the battlefield and go attacking. It also has a life draining sub-theme, which is kind of already built into vampires anyway, but this deck plays cards that take advantage of it, such as Bloodthirsty Aerialist and Savage Gorger, both of which get +1/+1 counters whenever we drain life. Well, the Gorger gets one once per turn at the end of turn, but the idea is if you drain life, you're going to get a +1/+1 counter, and then you get things like Dread Presence and Vampire Opportunist, which are repeatable ways to trigger a life drain effect. Now before we move on to our upgrades, let me say that most good vampire decks are black and white. I like to stick to the deck's themes when I make these videos though, so I'm going to show you how to upgrade this into a mono black vampire deck with a heavy life drain theme. However, I'll also give you some quick tips later in the video to show you how you can incorporate white and take advantage of things like Legion Lieutenant, for example. So anyway, yeah, let's get into our upgrades because this intro is already way too long. First off, we're going to take out 2 Vampire Opportunists and replace them with 2 Vampire Neonate. So the reason the Opportunist is in this deck is to act as a repeatable way to drain life. But the problem is the cost is so high that it's basically impossible to activate. 90% of the time, this is just going to be a 2 mana 2/1 with no abilities, because reaching that amount of mana is going to be tough in most games. The Neonate, on the other hand, is much easier to activate, requiring only 2 mana, and while it does need to tap, you can circumvent that by only activating it at the end of your opponent's turn. Basically, you hold this back as a blocker, and when your opponent passes the turn back to you, then you activate it, drain for 1, and then you untap for your turn. That way it's always untapped, but you still get to drain every single turn, so it's just a much more reliable way to trigger the Aerialist and whatnot. Next, we're going to take out 4 Savage Gorgers for 4 Sanctum Seekers. I know the Gorgers are one of our payoffs for draining, but the problem is it's kind of slow. Actually, it's really slow. It only triggers once per turn and only on your turn, meaning that at best it's going to take 2 or 3 turns to really make this, like a worthwhile card to play. Like ideally, we would want this to at least be a 3 mana 3/3 with flying, and it can't even possibly be that until like turn 5 or 6. So it's kind of cool in theory, but it's actually just really slow. And Sanctum Seeker just has way more impact on the game, and it can be incredibly explosive with the Aerialist. The Seeker says whenever we attack with a vampire, we drain the opponent for 1 life. Now the important thing to remember here is each vampire triggers individually. So let's say you attack with 3 vampires. You aren't draining your opponent for 3 life, you're actually draining them for 1 life 3 times. And why is that important? Because if one of those creatures is the Aerialist, it will actually get 3 +1/+1 counters. You drain for 1, get a counter, drain for 1, get a counter, and then drain for 1 and get a counter. So if this drained for 3, just a one-time drain for 3, you would only get 1 counter because that's only 1 instance of, that drain effect. However, since each one triggers individually, you actually get 3. So Sanctum Seeker is a pretty cool card in this deck for sure. It's also just a great vampire in general. Next, we're going to take out Gravewaker for an Epicure of Blood. So the Gravewaker doesn't do anything in this deck. It's not a vampire, it doesn't drain life. It's basically just a big clunky top-end threat, and And I do admit, I really wanted to find another big beefy creature like this to replace it with, but there aren't a lot of vampires that really fit this rule. I mean, Vampire Sovereign and Vengeant Vampire are kind of okay here too, but I think Epicure of Blood is the spiciest choice. It still has a reasonable battlefield presence, being a 4/4, which is pretty okay, but most importantly, it makes our opponent lose life whenever we gain life. So once again, this is going to get crazy with Sanctum Seeker, because if we attack with those 3 creatures again, we drain for 1 3 times, and then our opponent will lose 1 life 3 times from the Epicure of Blood. So even if we get matched up against a deck with bigger creatures, it can still just sit there and drain the opponent like crazy, and if the opponent is having trouble finding threats, then it can be a big beater that can go attacking as well, so it's not bad, even if it's, a little bit smaller and less of a big flying scary threat that the Grave Wicker is. Next, we're going to take out 2 Dark Remedies and replace them with 2 Cast Downs, though I will say that Walk the Plank is also fine here. Basically just any removal spell. Even Moment's Craving is okay. It only kills smaller creatures, so it's not perfect, but it's still an improvement over the Dark Remedy. Dark Remedy is just terrible, and I have no clue why it's in the deck. I don't really know why you want to pump the toughness of your vampires. I mean, I guess if the opponent plays a Lightning Strike on your Bloodlord, then you could save it, but honestly, that's rarely going to be relevant. Every once in a while you'll be able to do that, but being able to just blow up your opponent's biggest threat is going to be useful in just about every single game ever, so yeah, I'd rather have Cast Down over Dark Remedy. Dark Remedy, I don't know, pointless card to have in the deck. The last thing I want to do before moving on to the white upgrades is to take out 1 swamp for another Neonate, and this is simply because the deck has 25 swamps, and I feel that's a little bit more than we need. I don't know if the 3rd Neonate is absolutely necessary. Basically any vampire that costs 2 or less could go here, so long as it's not that unnecessary 25th land, it's fine. So like Dusk Legion Zealot, that would be okay. It seems weird having 1 random Zealot floating around, but it's just better than having that 25th land. But the Neonate is nice just because it is a repeatable source of draining, and that is what this deck wants to do. So that's what I'm going with, but either of these cards is kind of fine, so yeah, you can do whatever. Alright, that's actually all of our upgrades for the mono black build. However, I do want to show you how to upgrade this with the color white. So first off, you need to fix the mana base. So you should have 24 lands at this point, and I recommend at the very least just taking out 12 of the swamps and replacing them with 12 plains. It's kind of like a brute force, just cut it in half, but whatever. 12 and 12 is fine. At least you have an even distribution of swamps and plains, and at that point I would also recommend replacing basic lands with dual lands. Whichever ones you have, just take out 2 swamps and 2 plains for every 4 dual lands, whether you use guild gates, check lands, shock lands, dry lands, whatever. Just dual lands are good. So after fixing the mana base, the best upgrade is replacing Thirsting Bloodlords for Legion Lieutenants. This does wonders for the mana curve, because the mono black build is a little heavy on 4 and 5 drops. All we care about is the Lord effect anyway. We just want to pump all of our vampires, so being able to cut out a 4 mana Lord for a 2 mana Lord is super healthy for the mana curve. We're also going to take out a Blood Burglar for 1 more Legion Lieutenant, because we're a tribal vampire deck, so naturally we want 4 copies of the Vampire Lord. Even if it doesn't drain life, that's okay, because pumping our entire battlefield is going to be a lot more powerful and a lot more impactful pretty much all the time. I also want to take out the Vampire of the New Moons and replace them with Legion's Landing. So at the end of the day, we're paying 1 mana for a 1/1 vampire with lifelink. The difference is the Vampire of the New Moon has Death Touch, which is nice, but the Legion's Landing flips into a land that allows us to start producing 1/1 tokens with lifelink. And this is great because it shores up one of our greatest weaknesses, board sweepers. Also, did you get it? It shores up because it's a landing, so it shores. Okay, never mind. Anyway, tribal decks get absolutely wrecked by board sweepers because tribal decks want to fill the board with as many tribe members as it can muster, making them incredibly vulnerable to mass destruction spells. The great thing about Legion's Landing is it doesn't get hit by creature wipes, and it allows us to recover from them by producing tokens after all of our stuff has been removed. You can also upgrade Murder in the deck by replacing it with Mortify. Both of these destroy a creature for 3 mana, but the Mortify has the added benefit of being able to blow up enchantments. So it's all upside. There's literally no reason not to. If you're gonna pay 3 mana to destroy a creature, you might as well have the the option to target enchantments as well. And I think that's all of our upgrades. I will say that there are multiple directions you can take with this deck. For example, we stuck to the life draining theme, but you could remove things like the Aerialist and Blood Burglar and replace them with things like Adonto Vanguard and Sky Marcher Aspirant to push this more into a, like a vampire aggro deck where you flood the board with power really quick, play a Lord to make them really big, and try to kill off your opponent before they can stabilize. Knight of the Ebon Hand would also work really well in that style of deck. Someone asked me about that card in a comment. If that was you, yeah, this would be a perfect way to use this card. Knight of the Ebon Hand, it would be great in a more aggressive build. You could also try to go wider and take advantage of the Lord and Sanctum Seeker with things like Maverick Fane and Call to the Feast. This is way slower and super clunky, but the idea would be to try to build a board full of tokens and then just try to generate value from Sanctum Seekers, or just, constantly harass your opponent with them while they're being pumped up by Lords. That would be the idea. So you're just trying to go super wide with sheer numbers. There are also some cards that we couldn't afford, most notably Twilight Prophet, which is really good in this deck. It's kind of clunky being a 4 mana 2/4, but it gives us a repeatable source of life draining because it draws us a bunch of cards and forces the opponent to lose life and we gain life based on those cards' converted mana cost, so that's pretty cool. You could also upgrade the Sorin in the deck by replacing him with Sorin Imperial Bloodlord. This is far superior in most ways. It is fantastic in this deck. So his first ability gives a +1/+1 counter, which is a permanent boost, unlike the +2/+0, which only lasts until end of turn, and it gives a lifelink, which is actually better since that's what we want to do, is drain life with this deck. So the lifelink is pretty fantastic. The second ability is a little less impressive since you have to sacrifice a vampire to drain, but remember that we're going to be draining with the first ability, so we kind of have the second ability just pre-built into the first ability, so it's a little bit less impressive. But also keep in mind, since it comes into play 3 turns earlier, that we're going to have at least 3 +1/+1 counters and potentially multiple turns of draining before the original Sorin even sees the battlefield, assuming we draw 6 lands in the first place. So the +1 ability, the first ability of Imperious Bloodlord, is where it's at. That thing's amazing. And then finally, the ultimate, which isn't really an ultimate, it's kind of just it's -3 and it comes into play with 4 counters, but it basically allows us to ramp into a 4-drop on turn 3. We can play Sorin on turn 3, do the -3 ability, and put like a Sanctum Seeker in play if we want. Without question, the original Sorin's ultimate is more game ending. It allows us to basically take control of our opponent's board if we have vampires, but the problem is it requires 8 loyalty counters to activate, and since it costs 6 mana to cast, this isn't even going to happen until like turn 10 at the earliest, and that's assuming you get Sorin on the battlefield on turn 6, which you only have 1 of him, so it's not guaranteed. So yeah, that last ultimate on the original Sorin is, it seems super crazy, but it's just like, how often are you really going to activate it? I don't know, but man, that Imperious Bloodlord is just way better in this spot if you, want to spend money on it. If you do upgrade the Planeswalker, the Sorin's guides become useless, and you can replace those with a number of things. Epicure Blood is fine because you're basically getting 2 free toughness for the same cost plus the added ability, but basically any 4 or 5 mana vampire would be fine in this slot, be it Champion of Dusk, Vampire Sovereign, or even Twilight Prophet, as we mentioned earlier. Heck, if you took out the Thirsting Bloodlords for Legion's Lieutenant and the black-white build, you could even bring 2 of those back, because if you can't search for Sorin, Vampire Lord, these are just completely pointless to have in the deck. So the Thirsting Bloodlords, even though they're an inferior lord to the Legion's Lieutenant, they're better than a 4/2 with no abilities. Anyway, yeah, that video ended up being longer than I expected. Apologies for that, but at the end of it, I think we have a much more powerful deck than what we started with, regardless of whether you went all in on the black and white build. And we are under budget, so that's cool. So yeah, if you like these Planeswalker deck upgrade videos and want to see more of them, I have an entire playlist dedicated to them, and you can find a link to it in the description below. You'll also find my Amazon affiliate link, so if you want to support this channel, you can use that link, and then anything you add to your Amazon cart and purchase will give me a small kickback that I can use to upgrade this channel. It doesn't cost you any extra, and it's a free way to show your support, so I appreciate that. Also consider subscribing for more upgrade guides in the future, but in the meantime, thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.